palace courtyard ceremony had already begun when royal guard Adrian Keller noticed something unusual on the security tablet attached to the ceremonial post beside the crowd barrier. One camera covering the royal family seating area had just switched to manual privacy mode. That setting was never used during public events. Keller checked the command channel in his earpiece, but no operator had issued the change. Then he heard Princess Charlotte's voice somewhere behind the seating line. At the eastern perimeter of the ceremonial viewing platform, Royal Guard Adrian Keller stood beside the brass security rail that separated the royal seating section from the controlled public viewing area below. The late afternoon sun reflected faintly off the polished metal fixtures along the balcony, while the ceremonial band continued its measured performance in the palace courtyard. Keller's posture remained perfectly still, his gaze directed outward toward the assembled crowd, but his attention had shifted to the encrypted security tablet secured against his forearm. The alert had appeared only seconds earlier. One of the surveillance windows in the live monitoring grid had gone dark. Camera C-17, positioned directly above the row reserved for the younger members of the royal family, was no longer transmitting its live feed to the palace network. Keller opened the command log with a small, controlled movement of his thumb. The device responded instantly. The camera had not failed. Its system status remained active, its power stable, its connection intact. Instead, the log showed a manual command issued through the internal network. Privacy mode engaged remotely less than 2 minutes earlier. Privacy mode did not shut the camera off entirely. It simply prevented the video stream from reaching the command center and the mobile monitoring units carried by guards like Keller. That setting existed for very limited circumstances inside private royal residences, never during open public ceremonies. Keller's breathing remained slow and even as he studied the timestamp. No corresponding authorization notice appeared beside the command entry. If the command center had initiated the change, the system would have logged the supervisor's clearance code. This entry carried none. Keller shifted his focus from the tablet to the seating area just ahead of him, without moving his head. Princess Charlotte had been placed 2 chairs from the aisle, under the supervision of 2 attendants assigned to manage the children during the ceremony. At this moment, one of those attendants had stepped several feet away toward the rear service door, speaking quietly into an earpiece, while another staff member leaned toward the row of chairs. Charlotte herself had risen from her seat and stepped closer to the narrow walkway beside the railing, leaning slightly forward to watch the musicians below. From Keller's position, the movement was small, almost casual, yet he immediately understood the problem. With camera C-17 in privacy mode, the command center could no longer see the exact space where the child was now standing. It was not unusual for a child to stand during a long ceremony, but the absence of the overhead camera removed one of the quiet safeguards that normally watched that exact space. Keller expanded the system log further and located the device path used to trigger the command. The access point had not originated from the central command console inside the security wing. Instead, it had come through an auxiliary administrative terminal located somewhere within the palace interior network. That terminal normally belonged to operations staff responsible for event coordination, not surveillance control. Keller closed the log and transmitted a silent verification ping to the command center. The signal asked a single question without raising any audible alarm. Confirm camera status override. The reply returned almost immediately. Security control reported no override authorization had been issued from their side. That response confirmed what the log had already suggested. Someone outside the command center had accessed the surveillance system directly. Keller's gaze returned to the children's seating row. Charlotte had stepped slightly farther along the railing, her attention fixed on the musicians below, unaware that the camera above her position had stopped broadcasting to the very people responsible for monitoring her safety. Keller allowed several seconds to pass before initiating the next step, maintaining the outward stillness expected of a ceremonial guard while the information settled into place. The band's music carried upward from the courtyard, echoing against the stone facade of the palace, while the crowd responded with intermittent applause as the performance reached a transition in the program. Behind the royal seating section, the service corridor door opened briefly, and one of the event coordinators emerged, moving quickly toward the row where the children were seated. The woman spoke quietly with the attendant who had stepped away earlier, both of them glancing once toward the balcony wall where the disabled camera was mounted. Their conversation lasted only a moment before the coordinator turned back toward the corridor. That brief exchange introduced a new variable Keller had not expected. Event coordinators did not normally monitor surveillance equipment, yet both individuals had clearly acknowledged the camera's position.
Keller adjusted the tablet display again, pulling up the internal device registry connected to camera C17. The registry identified every terminal that had recently communicated with the device. One entry stood out immediately. The command had been transmitted through a portable operations tablet assigned to the Palace Event Management Team earlier that morning. That tablet had been distributed during the final logistics briefing for the ceremony, intended for adjusting stage lighting and coordinating performer timing. It should not have possessed the permission layer required to alter surveillance settings. Keller expanded the authorization chain linked to the command. The tablet had not acted alone. It had used a secondary credential to bypass the normal restrictions. The credential belonged to a mid-level administrative supervisor within the Palace Operations Department. That individual was not part of the security command structure. The implication formed quickly and quietly in Keller's mind. Someone with legitimate administrative access had overridden a surveillance camera covering the royal children during a live public event. The command center would eventually trace the anomaly on their own, but by then several minutes could pass, and Keller understood that small windows of time were exactly when security vulnerabilities mattered most. He returned his attention to the balcony seating area. Charlotte had now moved closer to the aisle separating the children's row from the rest of the seating section. The second attendant attempted to guide her back toward her assigned chair, but the child hesitated, distracted by something happening farther along the balcony. Several guests had shifted positions to photograph the ceremony from a better angle, briefly creating a gap between the chairs and the railing. Through that gap, Charlotte stepped another pace forward, closer to the open section of the balcony walkway used by staff moving between positions. Without the camera feed, the command center could no longer observe that small change in positioning. Keller subtly adjusted his stance and activated the guard-to-guard silent channel on his tablet, sending a coded message to the two protection officers positioned farther along the balcony perimeter. The message did not mention the camera directly. Instead, it instructed them to tighten visual coverage on the children's seating area until further notice. One of the officers responded with a brief confirmation signal. As Keller locked the tablet screen and returned it to standby mode, the service corridor door opened again behind the attendants. This time, the same event coordinator stepped out, accompanied by a tall man Keller did not recognize from the morning's security briefing. The man carried the operations tablet used by the event team. His eyes moved once toward the silent camera mounted above the children's seats before he began walking along the rear edge of the balcony toward the equipment control stations. Keller watched the movement without shifting his posture. The man's arrival explained who now held the tablet that had issued the privacy command, but it did not explain why the command had been issued in the first place. And until that question was answered, the camera that had gone silent remained more than a technical anomaly. It had become a gap in the protective system surrounding a child who had just stepped closer to the open edge of the royal balcony. Royal Guard Adrian Keller maintained his position along the eastern perimeter of the balcony as the ceremony continued below, the steady rhythm of the band echoing upward across the stone walls of the courtyard. From his vantage point, he observed the attendants guiding Princess Charlotte gently back toward the row of chairs assigned to the younger members of the royal family. One attendant lowered herself slightly, speaking softly to the child while guiding her hand toward the seat, and Charlotte complied without resistance, settling again into the chair closest to the aisle.
That small correction restored the visible order of the seating arrangement, yet Keller's attention remained fixed on the area surrounding the silent camera mounted above them. The system anomaly had not resolved itself, and the explanation offered by the command center only moments earlier had shifted the situation from a simple internal misconfiguration to something more deliberate. The security reply had arrived through the encrypted channel while Keller still monitored the log entries. The command center confirmed that no authorized console inside the palace had initiated the privacy command. Instead, their deeper signal trace had identified an external device briefly connecting to the local surveillance node before the camera feed was interrupted. That meant the command had not been issued through the palace control desks, but from a wireless signal originating somewhere within the physical perimeter of the ceremony itself. Keller absorbed that information without outward reaction while scanning the area beyond the brass barrier separating the balcony from the public observation line. Hundreds of visitors stood shoulder to shoulder along the controlled viewing lane beneath the balcony rail, many holding phones above their heads to capture the procession taking place in the courtyard. Among them, however, one figure drew Keller's attention through a small but deliberate movement. A man positioned close to the front barrier held a tablet rather than a phone, the device angled upward toward the row of surveillance poles installed along the balcony structure. The man appeared calm, almost patient, as if observing the equipment rather than the ceremony unfolding below. Keller's gaze remained forward while he studied the man through peripheral vision. The tablet in the man's hands was not being used to record video like the surrounding phones. Instead, its screen displayed a dark interface grid that pulsed faintly with movement, as though transmitting or receiving data. At the same moment, Keller's forearm tablet vibrated once with a silent system notification from the command center. Their technicians had begun scanning for active wireless connections operating near the surveillance network nodes, and the results had revealed a short-range signal burst that coincided exactly with the moment camera C-17 had been forced into privacy mode. The signal had originated somewhere within the ceremonial viewing perimeter, close enough to reach the camera's maintenance receiver without routing through the palace servers. Keller did not immediately report the observation aloud. Sudden communication over open guard channels could draw attention or create unnecessary alarm among the crowd and staff. Instead, he focused again on the man near the barrier. The tablet in the man's hands lifted slightly, as if aligning itself more precisely with the security pole above the children's seating row. That movement confirmed Keller's suspicion. The tablet was not simply receiving information. It was actively directing a signal toward the surveillance equipment mounted above the balcony. Keller allowed several seconds to pass while the scene continued unfolding naturally around him. The band below transitioned into the next segment of the ceremony, drawing the crowd's attention toward the procession entering the courtyard gates. That moment of distraction provided Keller with the cover he needed to transmit a controlled update to the nearby protection officers. Through the silent guard network, he sent a short coded advisory instructing perimeter units to monitor for localized electronic interference originating within the public viewing lane. The message avoided technical detail, simply indicating that a surveillance node above the children's section had received an unauthorized wireless interaction. The two officers positioned along the opposite balcony rail acknowledged the message immediately and began subtly adjusting their observation angles toward the crowd below. Keller's eyes returned to the man with the tablet. The individual remained in nearly the same position near the barrier, but the device in his hands had shifted orientation again, the screen now angled downward as if reviewing data that had just been captured. That brief adjustment suggested the transmission phase had already concluded. A moment later, Keller's tablet vibrated once more as the command center sent a new update. Their network scan had detected a second short signal burst from the same external source.
The burst had not reached the palace servers directly, but had attempted to communicate again with the disabled camera node. The technicians believed the device was attempting to maintain a temporary connection with the camera's maintenance receiver, a feature originally designed for authorized technicians performing equipment diagnostics at close range. That function normally required a coded authentication handshake before allowing any command to pass through the system. The fact that the camera had already entered privacy mode meant that handshake had somehow been bypassed. Keller processed the implications carefully. Whoever operated the external device possessed at least partial knowledge of the surveillance system's maintenance protocols. That level of familiarity suggested more than casual experimentation. It indicated preparation. Meanwhile, the attendants beside Charlotte had resumed their quiet supervision, unaware of the electronic exchange taking place only meters above them. The child leaned slightly forward in her chair, watching the procession in the courtyard while the ceremony progressed with its practiced precision. To the guests on the balcony, nothing had changed. The royal event continued exactly as scheduled. Yet within the security framework protecting that space, a small breach had already occurred. Keller raised his gaze again toward the public barrier. The man with the tablet had begun shifting sideways through the crowd, not hurriedly, but with deliberate patience, keeping the device lowered against his chest as he moved along the railing. The movement positioned him gradually closer to the section of the balcony directly beneath the children's seats. Keller opened the silent channel once more and sent a second coded instruction to the guards stationed along the interior corridor behind the balcony seating area. Without interrupting the ceremony or alarming the guests, they were to prepare for a quiet identity verification if any unknown technical personnel attempted to access the equipment stations or maintenance ladders along the outer wall. Keller closed the channel and returned to stillness beside the brass rail. The interference attempt had not yet escalated into open disruption, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Someone in the crowd had already proven capable of interacting with the palace surveillance hardware from outside the official network, and judging by the man's careful movement along the barrier, that interaction had not been accidental. It had been the opening step in something still unfolding within the crowded perimeter of the royal ceremony.
The ceremony continued with the same controlled rhythm that had defined the afternoon from the beginning. The procession in the courtyard advanced along its marked path while the band maintained its measured tempo, the sound of brass instruments carrying upward toward the balcony, where the royal seating section overlooked the gathering. Royal Guard Adrian Keller remained beside the brass security rail, his posture unchanged, though the quiet stream of information arriving through his forearm tablet had shifted the situation into a narrow margin of decision. The unauthorized signal that had forced the surveillance camera into privacy mode had not yet produced any visible disturbance among the guests or staff. From the outside, the event remained orderly and calm. The children were seated again beneath the disabled camera, attendants positioned close by, while the audience focused on the ceremonial display unfolding below. Yet Keller understood that the absence of visible disruption did not mean the threat had ended. The command center had confirmed that the external device responsible for the earlier signal burst remained active somewhere along the public barrier. Their technicians were attempting to isolate the device's exact position, but the dense concentration of personal electronics in the crowd complicated the scan. Keller's role, standing at the closest protective point to the affected surveillance node, placed the immediate judgment in his hands. Escalating the situation publicly would trigger an overt security response that could interrupt the ceremony and draw attention to the children's seating area. Maintaining silent observation would preserve the calm environment, but allow the unidentified device operator additional time to attempt further access. Keller weighed the two outcomes carefully while observing the movement along the barrier below. The man with the tablet had progressed several meters along the railing since Keller first noticed him. He had stopped again beneath one of the surveillance poles and raised the device briefly as though verifying its signal alignment. That motion lasted only a few seconds before the tablet lowered again against his chest. At nearly the same moment, Keller's forearm display vibrated with a new system alert transmitted directly from the command center's monitoring software. The external signal had returned. A second connection attempt reached the maintenance receiver attached to camera C17, and the system warning displayed a brief reconnection window measured in seconds. If the device succeeded during that interval, the surveillance node could drop from the monitoring grid again. Keller understood that waiting for further verification might allow the blind spot to reopen directly above the children's seats. This time, the intrusion detection system recorded the handshake attempt before rejecting it. The attempt lasted less than a second, but the pattern was unmistakable. The external device was probing the surveillance hardware repeatedly, searching for a path that would allow deeper access to the node controlling the children's camera. Keller allowed his gaze to remain fixed outward toward the ceremony while he processed the update. A single failed attempt could be dismissed as interference. A repeated attempt indicated persistence. Persistence meant intention. That realization narrowed the decision he had been weighing only moments earlier. The situation had moved beyond passive monitoring. Without shifting his stance beside the railing, Keller activated the encrypted command interface embedded within the guard tablet and opened the restricted protocol panel reserved for senior protective personnel assigned to ceremonial events. Among the options displayed was a measure rarely used during public royal appearances, the Ceremonial Emergency Stabilization Protocol. The protocol did not trigger alarms or visible lockdown procedures. Instead, it quietly adjusted the movement patterns of the palace security network around the royal seating section, redistributing guards and temporarily limiting access routes that could bring unauthorized individuals closer to the protected area. The command center normally initiated the protocol during severe disruptions, but the guard assigned to the immediate perimeter possessed the authority to activate it if an emerging threat was detected in real time. Keller entered the authorization sequence with controlled precision and confirmed the command. The system responded instantly. Across the palace security network, the protocol issued silent instructions to nearby personnel. 2 additional guards stationed along the outer corridor behind the balcony received orders to reposition toward the service entrances leading to the children's seating area. At ground level, beneath the balcony, crowd control officers were directed to slow the forward movement of visitors along the barrier, creating a subtle buffer zone beneath the surveillance poles without drawing attention to the change. Inside the command center, the monitoring software automatically flagged the affected camera node for priority observation, while technicians intensified their wireless scan for the external device. None of these adjustments produced visible alarm within the ceremony itself. The band continued playing, the procession maintained its route across the courtyard, and the guests on the balcony remained focused on the event below. Yet within the security framework surrounding the royal family, the protective perimeter had quietly tightened. Keller lifted his gaze again toward the public barrier. The man with the tablet had paused once more beneath the section of balcony directly below the children's seats. As the stabilization protocol redirected nearby crowd officers into slightly different positions, the flow of visitors along the barrier slowed, limiting the man's ability to move farther along the railing. For the first time since Keller had noticed him, the man hesitated. His eyes moved briefly across the surrounding crowd before returning to the tablet screen in his hands. That small pause confirmed Keller's assessment. The operator had recognized a subtle change in the environment. A few seconds later, Keller's device vibrated with another update from the command center. Their wireless scan had successfully isolated the active signal source, now transmitting within the barrier zone, one device matching the frequency signature of the earlier intrusion attempts. The location marker placed it within a few meters of the exact position where the man with the tablet now stood. Keller did not move from his post. The protocol he had activated was already guiding additional personnel into the area, closing the gap quietly and methodically.
The ceremony above continued without interruption, but beneath its calm surface, the palace security network had shifted into a higher state of readiness, responding to a signal that had begun with a silent camera and now pointed directly toward the individual standing at the edge of the crowd.
The ceremony in the courtyard continued with formal precision, but along the edges of the balcony the pattern of movement had begun to change in ways subtle enough to avoid immediate alarm, yet noticeable to those watching closely. Visitors standing along the public barrier first sensed something unusual when two uniformed officers from the lower perimeter stepped into positions they had not occupied earlier in the afternoon. Several spectators lowered their phones and exchanged brief looks as the officers widened the space along the railing, unsure why the guards had suddenly changed formation during the ceremony. Their movements were calm and deliberate, guiding the slow flow of spectators to remain behind the brass rail while creating a slightly wider space directly beneath the surveillance poles mounted along the balcony. To most of the crowd, it appeared to be a routine adjustment related to the ceremony's schedule, but several guests lowered their phones momentarily, sensing that the choreography of security personnel had altered. Above them on the balcony, Royal Guard Adrian Keller remained at his post near the children's seating section as the stabilization protocol quietly unfolded across the palace network. Behind the royal chairs, the interior service corridor door opened, and two additional guards entered the balcony perimeter, their presence blending naturally with the ceremonial formation already in place. Their arrival did not interrupt the event, yet their positions formed a protective arc along the rear access path leading to the section where Princess Charlotte and the other children were seated. Keller observed the adjustment without turning his head. The system notification on his forearm tablet confirmed that the command center had successfully regained control of camera C-17 after isolating the unauthorized connection attempts. The surveillance feed flickered back to life on the monitoring grid, restoring the overhead view of the children's row that had briefly disappeared from the network. The technicians reported that the earlier wireless interference had lost contact with the maintenance receiver once the stabilization protocol restricted the camera's external communication layer. That update resolved the immediate technical vulnerability, but it did not answer the question of intent behind the repeated signal attempts. Keller's attention returned to the public barrier below. The man holding the tablet remained in the same narrow section of space where the crowd flow had slowed. Around him, visitors adjusted their positions as the officers gently encouraged the line to maintain distance from the railing. The man's posture had stiffened slightly as he looked down at the screen of his device, apparently aware that something in the environment had shifted. At nearly the same moment, two plainclothes security officers moved quietly through the crowd from opposite directions, their path guided by the location marker transmitted earlier by the command center's wireless scan from the perspective of the visitors gathered along the barrier. The next moments unfolded with quiet efficiency that left many uncertain about what exactly had occurred. The two plainclothes officers reached the man with the tablet almost simultaneously, positioning themselves close enough to speak to him without raising their voices above the ambient sound of the ceremony. One officer gestured politely toward the device in the man's hands, while the other placed himself just slightly behind the man's shoulder, creating a controlled space within the crowd. The interaction lasted only seconds before the man allowed the tablet to be lowered and examined. No confrontation took place, yet several nearby spectators exchanged uncertain glances as the officers guided the individual away from the barrier toward a service passage leading out of the viewing lane. The movement was calm enough that the majority of the crowd returned their attention to the procession below, though a small ripple of curiosity moved through the front row of spectators who had witnessed the quiet intervention. On the balcony above, the restoration of the surveillance feed allowed the command center to resume normal monitoring of the children's seating section. Princess Charlotte and the other young members of the royal family remained focused on the ceremony below, unaware of the technical disruption that had briefly affected the security systems around them.
Nevertheless, palace staff had already begun implementing a precautionary adjustment to their supervision. One attendant leaned closer to the row of chairs and quietly asked the children to shift a few seats inward, away from the open aisle bordering the balcony walkway. The movement was gentle and natural, appearing to the audience as a simple effort to improve the children's view of the procession. Keller watched the adjustment while maintaining his formal stance beside the railing. The stabilization protocol continued to guide guard positions across the balcony perimeter, ensuring that no unsupervised access routes remained open near the seating area. Behind the chairs, the interior service corridor guards maintained their posts, while the command center verified the identity of the detained individual and examined the tablet device now in security custody. A brief status message reached Keller's display, confirming that the device matched the wireless signature responsible for the earlier signal bursts directed at the surveillance node. That confirmation did not yet establish motive or intent, but it did close the immediate gap that had appeared in the palace monitoring system. Below the balcony, the crowd's attention had already returned fully to the ceremony as the band reached the final movement of its performance. To the public, the afternoon continued without interruption. Yet within the quiet framework of palace security operations, the brief silence of a single camera had triggered a chain of decisions that had tightened the protective perimeter around the royal family without allowing the calm surface of the ceremony to break.
By the time the ceremony reached its formal conclusion, the courtyard had begun transitioning into the quiet dispersal that always followed large royal gatherings. The band completed the final passage of music, the procession exited through the ceremonial gate, and palace staff gradually guided visitors toward the designated departure routes outside the forecourt. On the balcony above, the royal seating section cleared in a carefully managed sequence. Attendants escorted the children through the interior corridor that led deeper into the residence, while senior members of the royal household remained briefly to acknowledge the departing guests below. Royal Guard Adrian Keller remained at his post until the final movement of the protective detail confirmed that the children had safely left the viewing platform. Only then did he lower his gaze to the encrypted tablet on his forearm, where the command center had begun transmitting the preliminary analysis of the surveillance disruption that had occurred earlier in the afternoon. The restored camera feed from camera 17 had already been stabilized and fully reintegrated into the palace monitoring network, but technicians had continued examining the data captured during the brief period when the system had been forced into privacy mode. Their analysis confirmed that the external tablet device seized near the public barrier had attempted to connect to the surveillance unit through a diagnostic maintenance signal normally reserved for authorized service engineers. The device recovered from the crowd had attempted to imitate that handshake using modified signal software. The attempt had not granted full access to the camera's internal system, but it had succeeded in triggering a temporary diagnostic state that placed the device into manual privacy mode. That brief state change was what had caused the camera feed to disappear from the monitoring grid. Keller studied the report carefully. The system logs indicated that the external device had repeated the handshake attempt several times after the initial disruption, probing the maintenance receiver to see if further control could be obtained. The camera's security layer had blocked those attempts once the command center restricted external communication access, but the first signal burst had already demonstrated that the surveillance hardware could be temporarily interrupted from outside the official network if someone stood close enough to transmit directly to the receiver. The remainder of the report focused on the chain of events that had followed the camera disruption and why the stabilization protocol had been activated during a live public ceremony. According to the command center's analysis, the moment camera 17 entered privacy mode, the monitoring network lost its only direct overhead view of the children's seating section. Although multiple guards remained physically present on the balcony, palace security doctrine required uninterrupted visual coverage from both human personnel and electronic surveillance whenever young members of the royal family were exposed to open public environments.
The loss of that coverage created a narrow but significant vulnerability within the protective system. Keller's decision to activate the ceremonial emergency stabilization protocol had immediately addressed that vulnerability by tightening guard positioning around the affected area and limiting uncontrolled movement along the barrier directly beneath the disabled camera. The protocol had also allowed technicians in the command center to isolate the wireless signal responsible for the interference, while additional personnel moved quietly into the crowd to identify the source. Without that intervention, the operator of the external device could have continued probing the surveillance node without drawing attention, potentially disabling the camera again at a moment when the children's supervision was less concentrated. Keller finished reading the summary while standing in the now empty balcony corridor where the afternoon ceremony had taken place. The sunlight that had illuminated the crowded viewing platform earlier had begun fading across the stone floor as palace staff cleared the remaining chairs and equipment. A final message from the command center confirmed that the individual detained near the barrier was now being interviewed by security officers, while the confiscated tablet had been transferred to the palace technical division for further examination. Whether the operator had intended only to test the surveillance signal or to exploit the maintenance receiver for deeper access remained under investigation. For Keller, however, the most important outcome had already been secured hours earlier when the stabilization protocol redirected the protective perimeter before the disruption could escalate. The camera feed had been restored, the children had remained under continuous supervision, and the ceremony had concluded without the public ever fully understanding why several guards had quietly shifted positions near the royal seating section. What the crowd had perceived as a brief adjustment in guard positioning had actually been the visible surface of a security response triggered by a single silent camera. An event measured in seconds, but serious enough to activate one of the palace's rarest protective protocols that Keller had chosen to activate while the ceremony unfolded around him.